Welcome back to another episode of Her Expat Life. We are the YouTube channel that is dedicated to informing, educating, entertaining, and inspiring females who live, work abroad, and have a global lifestyle. We also offer a comprehensive package of services for females who are looking to advance their global lifestyle, which you can find on our website, herexpatlife.com. And you can go through to our membership area and also see all of our global partners that we partner with that you can get exclusive discounts with if you are part of our membership program. Today, we are stepping slightly away from our normal content and we are chatting to a very, very inspirational person who is not only an expat herself and has lived the expat experience, but is also bringing forth the stories of women globally. And today we will be speaking to Fariba Nawa. She is the host and editor of On Spec podcast, which she co-founded as a group of freelance journalists in 2019. She is an award-winning investigative journalist who has covered wars, migration, and human rights from such places as Egypt, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Germany, and Turkey. Her work has been published in Time, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Financial Times, amongst other media outlets. She is also the author of Opium Nation and co-author of several other books, including The American Way, Stories of Invasion. On Spec podcast, in collaboration with The World, and returns for its fifth season with an 18-month-long investigation that takes you inside the secret war waged on dissidents by Iran. So as Iran claims to fight for Palestinian sovereignty, it's hunting down its own citizens who dare to advocate for freedom and human rights back home. Today, we will be chatting to Fariba about her work as well as the insights that she has uncovered through her journey. So, thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you on our show.
Thank you very much, Alexia. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, Fariba, so let's dive straight into it. So, you are a journalist, author, and editor. Please, can you tell us a little bit about your background, your personal journey, and how you became a journalist?
It's a long one. I've been in this business for almost 30 years. I knew that I wanted to be a journalist since I was 12 years old. I say it wasn't really a choice, it was a calling. So I started writing for the high school newspaper and then subsequently wrote for local media in the United States. I grew up part of my life in California, part of it in Afghanistan, where I'm originally from. And so I've been sort of a perennial refugee, I call it, expat, however we want to word it, but I'm used to not having roots anymore. Like I've lived abroad and prefer that to living to the US actually, and working as a foreign correspondent. So that was always my dream. And when I was, how old was I? 25. I started going abroad and all those countries that you mentioned. And I've been freelancing most of it. Somehow I wear a lot of different hats. So I worked for 2 years at a local newspaper and had a boss. But after that, it's been freelance. I take on, I've done a lot of journalism training. I have taught journalism at universities, and I love being my own boss and being independent. So I have a very strong attachment to independent media, and I think that's going to be the future for journalism. So that's kind of my background, and I love my job. It's my passion. And specifically reporting and talking to people and going to different places and getting to know new people, which is part of the expat experience, right? So
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're going to touch a little bit more on independent journalism and the new wave that we're experiencing and how the shift in the landscape is happening. But before we get into that, let's talk a bit about your project, On Spec podcast.
yes.
So On Spec, I'll quickly preface it a little bit so that everybody can know what it is. So On Spec podcast is an independently produced podcast based in Istanbul, Turkey, and you're a team of freelance journalists from diverse backgrounds living across the globe. On Spec podcast provides unpredictable deep dives in international news through storytelling from places like Brazil to Hong Kong to Malawi. How was this project born? What was the inspiration for this project?
Good question. It was during Trump's first term in the United States, and we here in Istanbul were all freelancers trying to commission stories, and we were being told constantly that it should have an American angle. Otherwise, it wasn't going to sell. And so we got very frustrated because the friends that I work with, they're both my colleagues and friends. We believe that stories from other parts of the world also matter without an American angle, with or without, right? And so
Mhm.
a lot of these stories weren't being told from people who are embedded in these communities, whether they're expats or, you know, native folks living in these countries. And we wanted to make sure there was a platform where they could tell their stories in audio. And the podcast itself was an idea that the younger journalists came to me and said, you have audio experience, you've worked in radio, let's do a podcast. And at first I was like, do you guys have any idea how much work a journalism podcast is? And
Yeah.
monetizing it would be really difficult. And they said, well, we're here with you, so let's do it. So it was born out of these colleague lunches in Istanbul, and everybody got really excited, and we'd have these brainstorming sessions about the name, what it should be. And then we started a Kickstarter between 6 to 8 of us. And our first fundraising was successful through Kickstarter. We were able to raise enough funds to do our first season. And we didn't really know all that much about how to do audio. I mean, I'd done radio, but radio is very different than
Mm.
podcasting and storytelling.
Yeah.
So we learned as we went along. And somehow, 5 years now, we've been able to, I think it's gotten better and better over the years. And like we've worked with, I've had the opportunity to work with so many different and wonderful journalists from all over the world. And I learned from them. We trained them, like you mentioned the names, Brazil, Malawi. We've trained journalists in all these parts in Africa, as well as Asia and Latin America. And then we help them write their scripts, but they do the reporting. They do the legwork. And then we put it out there. Specifically for this season, I did it, but that's rare.
So let's talk a little bit about this season, because the latest season of your podcast, the season is titled Lethal Descent, reads like a thriller movie plot, but in fact covers the chilling true story of the death of poet Mohammed Shabani, an Iranian dissident living in Turkey. How and why did your team decide to feature the story?
It started with the uprising of Masa Amini, right? In 2022, the Women Life Freedom Movement, which I think a lot of your audiences would be interested in because it was a woman-led human rights movement, and it's ongoing. In fact, the anniversary is coming up in September, and it was massive. And Turkey being right next door to Iran, there were a lot of protests here. So I started covering it, and we were looking for our next big story. And we said, let's do a mini series, because we did surveys and our audience was interested in a mini series, sort of something you can binge on, right? Most of our other seasons are like standalone. They have a theme like disinformation or borders. The borders one was very successful. It was real. How do real and imaginary borders define us? And we would go to different countries and then hire reporters and work with them in different countries to tell their own stories. This one, it just hit me. I was like, I'm covering this for The World, the radio, an outlet that I freelance for. Why not just turn this? Because it was coming up over and over. These dissidents in Turkey were being kidnapped, harassed, threatened, women and men. And they were incredible stories, as you'll hear if you listen to the podcast. I mean, like you said, it's like a movie. And I said, this is it. This is our story. And I'm reporting it. So that's how it all started. And then I teamed up with a producer I know at The World. And I said, hey, what do you think? They also wanted to start doing podcasting. And they said, yeah, this can work. And so that's how it all started. But we did not have any idea how long it would take or how deep we would go and what would happen. And so it kind of plays out throughout each episode. We had every rock I would look under, I'd find something new. And it'd be
Wow.
like, oh my God, I can't believe this. So we covered a trial, and the victims of the trial, I thought, were all gone, either kidnapped or left the country, because they were the Iranian regime was actively trying to kidnap them in Turkey. And then we ended up finding one, and how we found him was an incredible story in itself. And then he became one of the main characters in the podcast, one of the main sources. Also, I had to deal with threats, and it was just, there's so much plot and twists and turns to this podcast, but it's a heavy podcast. It's not something you need to, I think people who listen to it, we've gotten some really good responses, that it's riveting, it keeps them on the edge of their seat, but also that it's sad and can't believe that these things are happening, and can't believe how easy it is for authoritarian governments, not just Iran, to engage in something called transnational repression, which is like, going after your dissidents across borders, even. Like, they're not even safe after they leave the country. So That's how it all started.
Yeah, which is quite sad because I think most people living under these conditions believe once I get out of this country, I'll be okay. Like once I can seek refuge in another space, like it's harder to reach me. But stories like this really highlight that for some individuals, it's constantly a life of looking over your shoulder and being constantly worried. And as sad as these stories are, it's important that they're told. So yeah, I applaud you for the work that you're
Yeah,
doing.
thank you. I mean, it's sad, but also like people are so burnt out by all the misery fatigue, I'd call it. It's like I don't, a lot of people I talk to, we don't even read the news anymore. It's so
Yeah.
sad. We feel helpless. We can't do it. I feel like with this one, there's a lot of empowerment as well because of
Mm.
how people fight back. And you'll hear that. And I hope that inspires listeners to listen to it, not just for the good storytelling, but also that there is a bright side. And we did make an impact as we did this story. Yeah, we were
Mm.
able to help people directly.
Fariba, actually, as we're having this chat, I'm hearing some kind of sounds in the background. Can you tell us like where you are at the moment and
I'm
where,
I'm
yeah, what
in
we're
I'm in Turkey, and it's the call to prayer. And the call to prayer is 5 times a day here so
wow.
that people can be reminded to pray coming from the
Amazing.
yeah.
Okay, just for our listeners at home, if you were wondering what was that sound in the background, yeah, now you've got your answer.
Now you've got your answer.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the style of spec. So, spec is quite different from the trend because podcasting is huge at the moment, but it's different from the trend of this mass produced content that seems to be populating platforms. In fact, it seems that your team puts a lot of effort into curating deep dives on long form documentary style content that has been thoroughly investigated, which takes time. So, talk us through the strategy of why you chose to do this type of content and how this sets you apart from other news podcasts.
Yeah, great question. If people understood how much time and how much effort we put into narrative storytelling and in the field reporting, I wish they would appreciate it. I feel like it's not appreciated enough. We're not a chat cast, although we do that. What we do is we usually drop a story, and then we're going to do that for this season too. After the podcast is done, and we're almost there at episode 8 and 9 today. 8 was dropped, and 2 weeks later episode 9, and that's the last of it. We're going to have Q&A. So we do that to explain the reportage stories that we do. But those are the easy episodes, right? And sometimes they get more listens than the field reports that we do. And I guess honestly that kind of upsets me because we put so much work into making the documentaries. These are audio documentaries. And the reason we decided to do that is because that's good journalism. We're not just talking heads or talking voices of two people. I mean, like I said, we do that to give more context and explain. But what we really want to do is go out there in the trenches and, witness what's happening. As journalists, we bear witness. And that was the whole point, is that this is a journalism podcast. And so it's not just people with their opinions talking about what they think should happen. It's not opinion based, it's fact based. We do have fact checkers. We always fact check. I'll tell you one story about DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, that we did. It was called Pandemic Treatments That Kill You, basically. Not the exact title, but it was about how the people in the Congo believed that you could prevent the coronavirus from these herbal remedies. And there was something called, in the Congo, it's called Congo Bololo. It's an herb found there. They have a rainforest. And so most of their treatments, because there isn't enough medical care, a lot of people treat themselves. They use herbal things. But I did not know that if you mix Congo Bololo with specific things like lemon, it becomes poisonous. So people were dying because they thought they could prevent getting corona. And
Wow.
we had a reporter on the ground, and then we were trying to fact check this, because even though we always fact check, despite what the reporter tells us, we want a second or third source to tell us. And that was the hardest story to fact check. But we finally were able to do it by looking at news sources inside DRC, the Congo, and seeing that, yes, actually this herb can kill you. And that was fascinating to me. So, but the fact checking part is sometimes the most challenging, but the most important, I think.
Absolutely. And we're going to also talk a little bit later about misinformation, disinformation, and how we can kind of, as the general public, weave our way through this mess that's been created. But before we get into that, let's talk a bit about journalism in general, right? So we're seeing this massive trend, especially in the West, of people moving away from traditional media outlets and rather trusting and sourcing their news from independent journalists. What is your take on this? And do you think the landscape of journalism has been altered forever? And what does this mean for independent journalists?
It's a really difficult time for young and old journalists, especially veterans like myself. That's why we shifted and I stuck to freelancing because I just knew from what I was seeing the mistrust. And there's good reason for it too. It's become so partisan, polarized, and sort of social media has come in and you have a lot of citizen journalism on the ground where people, like for example Iran, right? There weren't many professional journalists who could report on Iran. Very few of us could go on the ground, and because they can arrest you and that's it, they can take you hostage, and they have done that. And so that's why independent journalism becomes so important, because citizen journalism I'm a little iffy about it, because if you don't know what you're doing and you don't check, again, you don't fact check, and you're just putting stuff out there without any kind of accountability. And that happens a lot on social media, as people know. It's hard for people to believe things anymore. They're calling this a post-truth era, right? But truth still matters.
Yeah.
And it matters. And in order for the rest of us to be able to raise our voices against human rights abuses, I think the industry's evolving. Some people think news is dead. I don't think so. I think people will always want to know what's happening out there. It's evolving and it's becoming more niche. So you have to pick your audience and you have to engage with that audience. That's very important. So that, but to what degree, right? We're not going to, if our audience says we want to do something that's politically to their advantage or something that we think is immoral, we're not going to do it, right? 'Cause we're not going to get out there and just spew what we think people want to hear in order to get more downloads. I think it's important to have a purpose and find, based on that purpose, find the audience that matches that purpose, that have the same goals and values you do, and then to grow that audience based on engagement with the audience. I think that's the new era of journalism right now. At least that's what we've learned. And we're still trying to connect with those folks. When we look at our analytics, it tends to be women who are living in a lot in the bigger cities, English speakers. Like, this is our audience, like who you guys are working with, her expat life. They tend to be from 25 to 55. And that's the audience we want to connect to and grow more so that we can give them what they want. So, then we'll do surveys and say, well, what can we do differently? What did you like and not like? I think that's the new media, and independent media in particular.
So, in general, do you think it's a good time for independent journalists? Because I guess previously people would trust more traditional media landscapes, and now it seems that there's almost more space for the independent voices. Do you think it is a better time for independent journalists? And how would you give advice, or what advice would you give to some young independent journalists who are coming into the space? Like, how can they maximize this opportunity?
Well, there's the pros and cons, right? Younger journalists coming into journalism have huge obstacles. So independent journalism is not cheap, and monetizing media outlets is an extreme challenge. And that's how we see it. So we've been able to survive through grants, donations. We have a Patreon subscription page. We have, Patreon members. So it's a diversity of revenue streams coming in. So it takes a lot of learning. And sometimes as independent journalists, we have to do everything. I barely had the time to market this season because I've been reporting it. So it's a challenge. That's a dog in the background. Jesus, I think she agrees with what I'm saying.
She feels very strongly about your message.
Yeah, feels good about this message. So I think it is a challenge to be able to monetize, meaning to make money from it, right? And we're still figuring that out. So my advice to younger journalists is to have a day job first, save some money before you do anything on your own. And you can become an influencer news journalist, basically based on Instagram or TikTok or Twitter or any of these. There are people like that, or YouTube, right? That have their own channels. For example, in Turkey, a lot of the independent media have gone on YouTube to be able to do what they need to do. And they've been able to monetize it because they had an audience previously. They already had a name. So that it takes time. And then you have to prove yourself. And if you fail, then you try again. I mean, we kind of, the beauty of our podcast is that we can go silent because we take a long time producing these episodes. These, just to give you a sense, like one episode takes 2 to 3 months to complete.
Wow.
Yeah, because of the many layers. And for this season, we hired a musician to score original music for us. And that was
Wow.
really special. So there's so many different layers to podcasting. There's the music, there's the voice, the sound bites.
Mm.
There is the narration, they call that tracks. You have to go into a studio. There's the field work, there's the ambiance, the background music, and all of that has to be put together. The script writing takes, oh, that's the hardest. That's the hardest. We're talking 5,000 word scripts at least with
It's a
each
lot of
episode
work.
that goes through 3 or 4 edits each time, and then putting it all together. That's what I mean. Print journalism, which is what I did initially, was so much easier. It was
Yeah.
so easier. It's, a friend said, I feel like print journalists are cheating sometimes because they could just see it and then put it on paper or put it on the screen, and so it's no longer print, but it's text, right?
Yeah.
Whereas audio and this type of very high quality audio journalism takes a long time. Yeah. So, and then that takes money too, right? It's not cheap. We did this season, we did it, we had $30,000, just to be transparent. We did $100,000 podcast for 30,000. And then my producer had to pay out of pocket for expenses because we went over budget in order to be able to produce a good podcast. So that, those are the, for new journalists coming in, the lesson is don't go beyond your budget. And right, don't go beyond your budget, and you may have to sometimes compromise on quality, but not facts, right? Not that
Mm.
we don't do that. What I mean by quality is, for example, do we hire a musician to score music? If we don't have the budget, then there's music libraries that we subscribe to and we take the music from that. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
So it would be much better if you can have original music for the podcast, because music is such an important part, just like a movie. But
Mm.
can't afford it, then you stick to the library that you
Mm.
pay, like you subscribe to a monthly subscription to. That's what I mean about skimping on quality if you don't have the budget.
Yeah.
These are some of the lessons that we've learned over the years. But I do encourage, the other thing that I would advise is don't reinvent the wheel. That's why innovation is so important, and be able to change yourself if that's what your audience is asking for, without losing purpose, of course, right? Yeah. Iteration. In business, they call it iteration. Just constantly reiterate and sort of reform yourself so that you're getting what you need and the audience is getting what they need. And there's a, like a symbiosis, there's a sync between you two.
Okay, let's talk a little bit from a viewer's perspective or a news consumer's perspective. So the words misinformation and disinformation are now deeply entrenched in our vocabulary, and we are all aware of the need to cross-check facts and narratives. What is your advice to ordinary people who want to consume trustworthy and unbiased news, but don't have the time to research everything? How can we identify mis and disinformation, especially now in an era where things like AI generated videos and content is becoming increasingly good? So it's harder to kind of sieve through this. How can the everyday person on the street put checks and balances in place in their life to try to find the truth through all of this chaos?
Great question. I struggle with this too. You know, that as a professional journalist, we struggle with this, especially with AI coming in. I think there are people are using AI like ChatGPT. There's some positive elements to AI, but when it comes to disinformation, maybe we can find AI that will stop. Maybe that's what eventually is going to, AI will stop AI from lying. You know what I mean?
That's a good
So
take.
yeah,
Yeah.
there might be a technology, or maybe it's already out there, where you can just put the article in or the audio in and it'll tell you if it's real or not. That's what I'm hoping for anyway, because right
Mhm.
now it's a mess. It's a mess out there, right? I stick to the names that I know, whether it's publications or people that I
Mm.
trust on the ground. And then in terms of publications, but it's, to say unbiased, I don't think there is such a thing. I think
Mm.
everybody has a bias, and it's very important for us to come and be honest about that bias. And we do that with spec. One of the things is that we have to say why we're covering this issue. Why is it important to
Mm.
us personally, and what our bias is? So with Iran, I talk about being an Afghan, and I speak the language. We speak the same language, Farsi or Persian, and how I see sort of Iran as my sister country, and the struggles of the women are very similar to struggles of women in Afghanistan, and how we can fight that together. So that's, I came out initially and I talked about that, why it matters to me to do this story. So I think it's important that we get that from people who are creating the news, and that you as an audience member or consumer sort of demand that. You have a right to demand from whoever you're listening to, if what's the sourcing on this, right? I do that on Twitter all the times. Like, I see people posting stuff, I'm like, what's the sourcing on this? Who told you this? And if they're like, we don't know, then I don't share it often, because that's how you stop misinformation or disinformation from happening. But the political sides of this, where politicians are just constantly telling us lies, we have to be aware. Yeah, that's where the journalists come in, and they're sort of the gatekeepers of the news, right? We have to be diligent about it. It's hard. I'm learning as I go along too.
I think that's where independent journalism is really giving us a lot of hope, because I think when it comes to political narratives and institutions being kind of hijacked by political institutions, that's why people are stepping away from traditional media. It's like, oh, I don't believe anymore that this is news. It feels more like propaganda. It feels like there is a mouthpiece for a certain ideology, viewpoint, political persona. And I think that's why independent journalists are so important. But you did mention that it's difficult, or like there's a difference between citizen journalism and independent journalism. So, how do we figure that out? How do we find someone on YouTube or on Twitter, and how do we figure out if this person actually, like, what defines a journalist? Is it someone that has the qualifications, that studied it, that has X years of experience? What is that defining point between a citizen journalist and an independent, legitimate journalist?
Great question. Yeah, I think a citizen journalist is, you're in a protest, you're an activist, and you're taking videos and you're posting them. And as consumers of that, we have to know, and also how people introduce themselves on social media. If they're talking about themselves as a change maker, or I look for those buzzwords. Yeah. And if they call themselves a journalist, I want to see that they have worked in that field. Journalism is not so much about studying, but about experience, and what kind of experience, right? So for me, the journalists that I follow, I am a big stickler for knowing languages. So if a journalist speaks the language of where they're reporting from, I feel like it's going to be more accurate, right? And I don't necessarily speak fluent Turkish at all. I usually have a friend who's a translator with me, but I get by enough so that I know somewhat what's going on. In other countries that I've been to, I do speak it. I speak some Arabic as well, but it's unrealistic for foreign reporters, especially, to be expected to speak every language. But to me, that's one marker of accuracy, is that The second thing I look for is what their bias is, as I mentioned, right? And I think citizen journalism, they really do have a much stronger political affiliation than a journalist who has experience and has worked in the field. And also, like, who did you work for, right? If you're just on your own all the time, then you're the only outlet. And maybe over time you will be a journalist. For example, like John Oliver. He's basically, to me, a comedian / journalist, because he fact checks. So that's another thing, is I feel like you can become a journalist if you understand the importance of facts and context, right? And context is really, really important. It's not taking things out of context and understanding people for what they are. So I think if you watch someone over time, or if you listen to them or read their work, you'll know if this is accurate or not. Yeah. But also to do cross references, right? Don't stick to just one outlet or one person. And what I do is I like to read conservative newspapers, as well as more progressive or liberal. And that way I feel like I get the whole gamut. So yeah.
Yeah, I can relate to that, because like I obviously have quite strong views on certain things, and I'm very aware that my algorithm knows what my preferences are, so I keep seeing the same things that are feeding already this opinion that I have. So I really try to push myself sometimes to go and listen to the people who I really don't want to listen to, because I feel like either one of two things are going to happen, right? Either I'm going to understand a different perspective and see a different lens, the same situation through a different lens, or I'm going to be able to argue my point stronger because I understand what the other side's positioning is on something. So I really, and sometimes it's difficult. I don't want to listen to certain people because I really don't agree with what they have to say. But I think as a society, we need to move to a place of like being able to listen to different voices, even the ones that infuriate you. Because if you can't do that, then you really don't know how to start digging for the truth. Because, like you said, everybody has bias. So even the sources that you like, that you trust, they've already put their layer of their viewpoint on things, or there's a little bit of a skew. So yeah, it's difficult, but I think that's really a big key is like open yourself up and listen to the voices that even the ones you don't want to listen to. Like there's something that's you're going to learn from that.
I think it takes a certain level of awareness and work to do that, right? Social media makes us lazy. So one of the
Very.
things that we've seen in terms of the trends in media consumption is that people are stepping away from social media, but going on actual websites. Websites are
Mm.
coming back in again because then you know where it's coming from, what the original source is, right? And
Hmm.
so I will go, and I don't agree with Fox, but I will. In fact, it's funny, but Fox in Turkey is the more progressive outlet, and Fox News in America is the very conservative one, right?
Yeah.
So, but I will, and I go just to see what they're covering, like you said, and get a sense of what they're presenting to their audience, because then you know if your neighbor is watching Fox, how you can talk to your neighbor. But it takes work. I think people
Yeah.
tend to just sort of scroll and share. It's an echo chamber is a real problem. It's a real
It
problem.
is.
And we
It
need to
is.
get out of that. We need to get out of it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, we're going to pivot a little bit into another project that you're doing, and you're going to have to help me with some people's names because I don't want to butcher them. But you did a project, right, called Intersectional Feminism in the Middle East and Central Asia. So this is a project by Nat Geo Explorer, yourself, and a Turkish journalist, photojournalist, I believe. If you could just share this
Yeah.
person's name.
She's actually, I'm in her home right now.
Okay.
Özge Sebzeci. She's a well-known photographer. She's become a rock star in my book with some of the photography she's doing. She was the multimedia producer for this project as well. And
Amazing.
so Özge and I share a love of human rights. And so we've been working together for 8 years, almost 9 years, to put out stories from Turkey and elsewhere. And this was one project that she came up with, actually. And I said, yeah, let's do it. We applied, we got the grant, and from Nat, and became Nat Geo Explorers, which is a really prestigious title for us, and we're proud of it. And we're able to travel to Central Asia and look at some of the issues that women were dealing with, as well as Turkey.
Amazing. And what insights did you get from this project in terms of the feminist movement in the Middle East and Central Asia?
That there isn't enough solidarity among women in Islamic societies in particular, and that but in countries like Turkey there is. I mean, I will tell you that as Gay and I've been covering women's rights in Turkey for that long, and I have never seen a strong intersectional, meaning Kurdish, Turkish, disabled, queer, just amazing solidarity. They, of course, they have their schisms and differences, but when it comes to March 8th, International Women's Day, these women come together, and they are fighting tooth and nail in parliament to preserve the laws that they fought, that their predecessors fought for. And it works to some degree. So Turkey is definitely an example of intersectionalism. And some of the stories we did, for example, the Time story last year, right before Turkish elections, is about how religious women stood up against the president of Turkey and wanted a new leader because they felt that he was going back on his promises on women's rights. And so, he has a lot of support among religious women, but then there are these other women that work with religious women, but still felt like they don't want this anymore. They want someone else to come in because it's been 20 years. But President Erdogan won, and there's rule of law here, so people respect democratic results. But yeah, we learned that. And then from Central Asia, we went to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. That was really exciting for me because I'd never been. And those are former Soviet bloc countries. And I lived under Soviet invasion. That's the war that my family fled, and that's how we ended up in America. So I know what it's like to be under that kind of authoritarian rule. And so we got to experience that again in Tajikistan. We had to basically work undercover, go into people's homes, and we were focused on polygamy, but we never got to write that story because, again, when we try to commission stories, there has to be interest from other outlets. And this was, we didn't, and I did a radio story and we did a couple things, but it wasn't what we had hoped. We didn't get the big long form text piece that I had hoped for. But maybe in the future I can go back. But basically, what we learned is that a lot of men, polygamy is illegal and has been since the Soviet era in these countries. It's also illegal in Turkey, but it's becoming more and more and more common in places like Tajikistan, and why that is. So that's what we looked into. And so we would go inside homes and interview women who had to deal with husbands who had up to 4 wives, and why that was and how they felt about it.
Mhm.
So that project was focused on those things.
And when you say you went into the homes and spoke to these women, what was the overarching sentiment like? Because in a lot of these cultures, it's kind of accepted that that's just part of tradition, whereas in other cultures, there are women who are part of a system that they don't necessarily want to be part of. So, what was the overarching kind of sentiment in this case?
The overarching sentiment was that they were suspicious of us because they're living in a country that this kind of journalism we're doing actually never existed. And you do what you're told. And the first thing they would tell us is, we love our president. We love our president. And then they would talk about their life stories. So the
Wow.
fear is so huge that it's hard to get to the actual criticism. But what we were going in, we weren't doing a political story. It becomes political, of course.
Yeah.
We were doing something based on a societal tradition, but the law was saying that it's illegal. So that was where what we wanted to know is like, it's illegal. How do you feel about this? And the women were critical of it. They said, well, we've been forced to accept it, but this is wrong.
Mm.
So they did have a sense that it was wrong in Tajikistan. And then in Uzbekistan, what we found out was so fascinating, that there's these countries in Central Asia are trying to form a new identity from their Soviet past to this. They weren't allowed to practice their religion. So now you have religion, which is Islam for most of them, and their knowledge of Islam is, a lot of it is based on YouTube imams, like preachers, telling them things like, if you become a second wife, you will get credits for heaven. And so people will actually believe that. And we talked to women who thought that if they become second and third wives, they were going to go to heaven. So there's a lot of misinformation about religion
Wow.
on social media channels, and everybody has a phone now, and that. But the main reason that men end up marrying is because they become migrants and go to Russia and work and then get lonely, so they marry a second wife or a third wife. So there's a socioeconomic reason for that. So there was a
Okay.
multitude of things going on, but it was scary because when you're working undercover, you never know what's going to happen. And so we were really careful, and most of them didn't want to give their names. That was the other reason that this story was hard to publish, because most Western outlets want to be able to fact check, and without names, how do you fact check, right? Even though we're
Yeah.
telling them this is who she is, they want their fact checker to be able to find that person. Anyway, so that's kind of what was the challenge with that
Yeah.
story. Yeah.
I hope sometime in the future you're able to go back and kind of dig into this again, because I think it would be very interesting to understand it on a deeper level. Like you said, I think there's a lot of layers to this, like what's driving this, and I think it could be quite an interesting story.
We would love to, but when I came back from Tajikistan, we applied for press visas and press accreditation, and it didn't come in time. So we got on a plane and went, and then they gave us visas at the airport, like tourist visas. And then when I came back, Tajikistan rejected my press visa. I was like, oh, I already went. So it's not easy to work as a journalist there, especially for someone like me. The other thing is about identity. People will see you, governments and people in those countries will see you. They define your identity based on where you were born, what the color of your skin is, what religion you are, right? So I'm an Afghan American, but they will see me as they see me. And often I don't know what that's going to be, especially like, are you Muslim? And if I say, well, yeah, I always say, yes, I was born a Muslim, right? I'm not particularly observant or religious, but I do call myself a Muslim. So that makes a difference. Your
Yeah.
positionality to them makes a big difference in how they respond to you and how they trust you.
Yeah.
Yeah. My Afghan American passports, often with a lot of countries, is a big problem. Like
I can imagine.
Iran
Yeah.
doesn't either of those passports. So it was never easy to get a visa to Iran. I feel like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan will also have the same bias in that regard.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the feminist movement in general. So, where do you think the current wave of feminism, particularly as it's understood and practiced in the West, is failing women in the Middle East and Asia? How can we change this and allow space for these voices to truly be heard and represented? So, where are we dropping the ball in the West?
Oh
How are
boy,
we misrepresenting people?
I mean, that's such a big question, and I've done so much work on this that I could talk about it for hours, but I'll keep it short. I think if there was an article in The Guardian that just came out that sort of generally speaks to gender equality and how we're going backwards. And I think that has to do a lot with the sort of fascist right-wing movements that are becoming very popular globally. So it's not just Western, quote unquote, feminism failing, but overall, men are becoming more angry with women. And I think it's a direct response to women doing better in most countries. In the universities, getting university education, entering the workforce, becoming economically powerful. Often, when things like that happen, there's a backlash. And so we're seeing a bit of a backlash. And of course, in America, look, we just lost reproductive rights. I mean, I just was expecting so much more of a backlash to that from the feminist movement in the US, and there hasn't been. There hasn't been, and it's very disappointing to see that as a feminist myself, right? I think this question is such an integral part of my upbringing because as an Afghan woman coming from an extremely conservative society, and you see what the Taliban are doing, we were never that bad. What the Taliban have brought into Afghanistan is, again, it's a very specific village culture. I don't even know what it is. It's mixed with an ideology that's very foreign in some ways, especially when it comes to girls' education.
Well, sorry to interrupt you. For our listeners at home who aren't fully like up to date on what's currently happening, like what's the most recent news out of this region? So what is currently being implemented?
So after the US left Afghanistan, basically the Taliban won. And the Taliban said that they would allow girls to go to school initially, but they lied. And everybody and all the politicians fell for it. We, those of us like me, I'm very angry about this. I get very emotional talking about this because I kept warning about this the entire time. And I have a platform when it comes to Afghanistan because I've been writing about it and I reported out of Afghanistan as an adult for many, many years. Most of the bulk of my work has focused on Afghan women in Afghanistan. And I said from day one, the Taliban are not going to allow girls to go to school beyond sixth grade. That's exactly what happened. They did exactly what they did in the 90s. And so as the years go by, they've been back in power for 3 years now. It gets worse and worse and worse. We just saw another decree where they basically said they can't go out without a male chaperone, someone who's related to them, and they cannot speak out loud or laugh out loud. Their voices are too intimate for men. So, these are all these very, very misogynistic beliefs about women, sexualizing women and saying that they should just stay home and procreate. That's all what they're there for. There's no use to women and they can't work. So it's become, and I have cousins in Afghanistan and friends and colleagues who are really, really suffering right now. So in terms of how we can help, we're really grappling with that. I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to get people out. I'm trying to get women out, and however we can, with scholarships, with asylum applications, with sponsorships. The ones who are in urgent need to get out, the ones who want to. So how can Western feminism, let me go back to your question because it's such a big question. The one thing we need to understand about that's fundamentally different, I think, is that in the West, we look at the individual and individual rights as being the most important. And Iran's women life freedom movement is moving toward that. They want individual freedoms, like the right not to wear a headscarf. But more and more in places like Afghanistan, the headscarf is a non-issue because most women wear it and want to wear it, right? It is understanding that women come with a family, that they're not an individual unit as such, but they are part of a family. So when we're considering what's best for them, we have to consider their sons and husbands and daughters and work within that framework, right? So I'm probably guilty of not always considering that either. Because when I see fathers and sons who are actually berating the women in the family, when I see them pushing them down, then I no longer want to work with them and give and lift them up, right? And that it becomes a conflict all the time for me, even because I want to help the women, but you can't just help the women. You also have to help the family. So that is like a very basic difference that I would say between so-called Western feminism and what we consider women's rights in these parts where I live. So yeah, hope that.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. I know it's a very difficult topic to talk about. I do just feel like even though we do talk about intersectional feminism, I do feel like sometimes in the West we drop the ball in being open minded to how different feminism can look in different parts of the world and the needs in different parts of the world, and kind of just applying our viewpoint and not really listening as well as we speak sometimes. So I think it's really important to try to understand. When you say,
I'll give you some of the issues that I think are not so easy to listen to. For example, the Taliban have fangirls, I call them, who claim that they're perfectly okay with what they're doing, that they brought quote unquote safety to women. So therefore, it's okay not to go to school. It's okay not to go to a bathhouse even. Many villages in Afghanistan don't have running water. So people need to go to the public bathhouses to bathe. They're not allowed to do that anymore. And so these girls, these fangirls and fanboys, of course, there's a lot of them. So I'm listening to them and I'm trying to understand them, but I cannot agree with them. It's very difficult for us to move forward when they're going to prop up a group like the Taliban and their ideas, right?
yeah,
Same thing with feminine FGM, female mutilation,
genital mutilation, yeah.
genital mutilation. There are women who say this is part of our tradition and we're okay with this. I have a very hard time understanding that and listening. And okay, I'll listen to it, but I'm still going to fight against it. So this is maybe that just makes me a Western feminist, but I think there are basic tenets of human rights where women should not be mutilated, men or women, but women
Mm,
specifically because of their gender, and should have equal rights. That's basically what I believe. And if that's Western feminism, so be it. And if a woman says, I'm okay with this, then I wouldn't force it anything other than that on her. But
mm.
I just, yeah, there's basic tenets, I think.
Yeah, it's a very difficult topic because, like, also at the roots of feminism is like we want to have a society where women can decide what's best for themselves in whatever situation. So sometimes you do find yourself with your back against the wall when you hear these things, and you're like, oh, my urge is to kind of take you away from this, but also, you have a right to decide what's right for yourself. I think the bigger question here is, okay, so you have a right to choose for yourself within this society, but do you acknowledge that every woman should have the right to choose for herself what her reality looks like? And if you're not part of a society where every woman can have the right to choose what she wants to do with herself, you should see that as a problem, because
Yeah.
you feel that you should be able to do the things that you feel strongly about, which maybe I don't agree with. And I have to at some point respect that, even though I question why you have those beliefs. But if you don't think that every woman should have the ability to practice her beliefs and her what she wants, her freedom of expression and self, I think maybe that's the little entry room into
Yeah,
having this very
precisely.
difficult conversation of
Yeah,
how do
precisely.
we try to create spaces of safety for all females, regardless of their belief systems, their religion, their ideology in these places.
Precisely. The law though is defining, right? So what is
Yeah,
the law toward women is, again, I mean, no country should decide what we should wear, right?
no,
That's,
I
if you
agree.
want to wear the niqab, let them wear the niqab.
I
It's
agree.
basic to me, but there's so much discussion around it, and it's like, why is that even an issue anymore, right? So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Okay, so to end off today's discussion, Fariba, what do you want your legacy to be, and how would you like your life's work to be remembered one day?
Wow, I haven't thought about this. I want to be remembered as someone who uplifted women and tried to do journalism that, let me think about this. This is a good one. I just still feel like I have so much more to achieve that I didn't even think about what a legacy I want to read. I would like to be known as a journalist who did try to make a difference for the better, for the betterment of humanity. And that's really broad, but honestly, that's kind of what a lot of journalists want. And
Yeah,
we don't do just journalism for journalism. Some people do, but for me, the impact matters so much that it for the like we work for so little money, so little, if that at all. So for this project, for example, Lethal Descent, the podcast, we were able to help get 3 dissidents to safety. One
amazing.
ended up in France, one is already in the US, another one is on his way soon. And that is huge for me. Even this kind of individual impact. On a policy level, of course, we all want that, right? That's sort of your legacy is like, Fariba Nawa was able to change a so-and-so law. That's just expecting too much, right? But
Mm,
that's kind of what I want. And also individually inspiring people to do the right thing. I
Mm-hmm.
would love my work in Afghanistan, which is more starting to be more activism than journalism. Honestly, that's where I stand. I've shifted my focus on Afghanistan. In Turkey and Iran, I have an emotional distance so that I can still be somewhat of a neutral journalist. Whereas in
Mm-hmm.
Afghanistan, I'm pretty much an activist at this point, more behind the scenes. And I would love for young girls to see what I do with my life and to be inspired by that and try to do the same. So that's kind of what I want my legacy to be. And I have two daughters, and I've tried to be there for them to make the best decisions that they, for their own future. Yeah.
Aniba, well, as a female, I thank you for your work. I think what you do is inspiring, and I think you will definitely leave a legacy of inspiring the next generation to make sure their voices are heard and to lead with integrity. I get the sense that integrity is quite important to you. So yeah, I thank you for your work, and I think it's really important what you're doing for the world in general, not just for a certain specific group. But yeah, and I applaud you and all independent journalists who are doing really difficult work with maybe not a lot of recognition and not always the thanks that is deserved. So yeah, just a
Thanks
round
so
of
much.
for your
That
team and the work that you're
means
doing.
a lot. Thank you. Yeah, we do need a little bit of the recognition. It would be nice. It just, and also the funding. The bottom line is funding so that I can keep doing the work that we do, because then that's how I can pay the local journalists that I work with. So yeah, I'm excited for our next season and for the rest of this year for On Spec. We're going to keep going with, like I said, Q&As. The host Nafisa Haji, she's going to be doing more Q&As with people who are experts on Iran, also transnational repression. And then after that, we will play in podcasting. We do a lot of collaborations. So we will
Mhm.
play another podcast documentary about Afghan women, because right now that's very topical and urgent.
Mhm.
So yeah.
So before we say goodbye, can you tell people where they can find your work and how they can reach out to you? How can people follow your projects?
Sure. So onspecpodcast.com is our website. And from there, you can listen to the episodes in every season. But most people want to go to Spotify or Apple. And sometimes it's hard to find us. So it's on
Mm.
spec is two different words, and space SPEC, and then podcast. You have to put podcast in there and it'll come up, and then you can listen and browse. Also, we have a Twitter account. It's called at On Spec Stories. On Instagram, we're On Spec Podcast. Me personally, I'm working on redoing my website, but I'm on Twitter as Fariba Nawa. I'm very active. Facebook is a very large community for me, and I love discussions on Facebook. So, but I have a private account, and I'm very careful about who I let in for safety reasons. So for Fariba Nawa, you can always write me a message separately if you want to be friends. And then once you're my Facebook friend, then I keep in touch regularly. So those are the places that I am most active in. Instagram, TikTok, I barely do anything on those platforms. I'm kind of old school with the Facebook discussions. And OnSpec also has a Facebook account, and we do have an Instagram account, but no TikTok. So yeah, it would be great to have you guys listen and give feedback,
Amazing.
rate and review the podcast. You can rate and review Lethal Descent, and you can also just search up Lethal Descent. But it's on two podcast feeds. It's on the World as well as on Spec, and you can rate and review it. That would be great, because what's happened, I want to tell you that one way that authoritarian governments will kind of try to stop you from doing your journalism now is actually rate down. We had a bunch of people go, I don't know if they were real people or bots, go and rate down the podcast in Europe, and we knew that it was sort of it was an engineered method. It wasn't individuals listening, because there was gibberish, and we reported it to Apple
Mm.
Podcasts. That's how you bury a podcast, so that people don't even see it
Wow.
and not give it visibility. So what would help is if people do give us, rate and review, because that will bring it up in the podcast feeds for other people. So
Absolutely. We'll make sure to also link all of that information in the info box. So, to make your lives easier, if you're listening at home, I highly, highly recommend you go and listen to the podcast and follow Nadiba's work. Nadiba, thank you so much for speaking to us today. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor to have you on our
thank,
channel.
thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
For the listeners at home, we'd love to hear your feedback on today's episode. What did you think about our discussion points? Do you have any follow up questions you'd like us to deep dive into with Fariba? Are there any topics in the future you'd like us to cover? Please, we want to hear your voices, so let us know in the comment section. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. Make sure to follow us on all our social media pages and visit our website, herexpatlife.com, to get a full comprehensive understanding of all of our services that we offer. And until next time, we hope to see you soon.